Hey everybody, great to be learning with you today as we continue our studies of Sefer Bereshit, and in particular pay attention to the fourth day of creation described in Perek Aleph, Psukim Yud Daled through Yud Tet. As you've already had the chance to explore, the Torah tells us about the fourth day that Hashem created two great lights, Yehi Me'orot B'Arkia Hashemayim, that these two lights should be brought into existence in the Rakia, which was already discussed on the second day. But the placement of these acts of creation, the sun and the moon, is strange because it really should have been mentioned on the second day with the creation of the Rakia. If indeed they are placed B'Arkia HaShemayim, would it not have made more sense to mention the description of the sun and the moon and the creation of these great lights on the second day? Rashi, as you've already had the chance to see, points out that they were already created, indeed, on the first day when it said, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, anything related to Shamayim and anything related to Aretz was created on that first day, at least the blueprint, but was only activated and brought into formal existence on a particular day that followed. So in this instance, the sun and the moon, which belonged to the heavens, were created, at least existentially, on the first day, when Hashem brought Shemayim and Aretz into existence, but were activated here on the fourth day. But a real serious question that we have to contend with has to deal with the description of these two great lights. As you had the chance to explore in your studies with the Chavruta, Hashem creates two lights. Vayas Elohim et Shnei HaMe'orot, and how are they described? Hagadolim, the two great lights. Et HaMe'or Hagadol, Lememshelat Hayom, the great light that would shine during the day, meaning the sun. Vet HaMe'or Hakaton Lememshelat Halayla, and the small light that would shine at night, that referring to the moon, Ve'et HaKochavim, and then the stars. So there are two lights that are described here, both originally mentioned as Gedolim, but then in a subsequent description in the very same pasuk, there's a shift. Me'or Hagadol and Me'or Hakatan. So what changed? If they were indeed both great lights, then how come the sun, the Me'or Hagadol Lememshelat Hayom, is described as staying great and big, but the Me'or Hakaton, the moon, suddenly becomes diminished in size? So there's a famous Midrash that I want to bring to your attention here, and it basically goes like this. The sun and the moon were arguing with one another about their status. Remember, the Torah says they were both great lights, and each one contended that it was the greatest. And then the moon puts out an argument and says, it is impossible for there to be two kings with one crown. You can't have two rulers sharing the same crown. And in fact, we know this to be true from real life. There is no co-president of the United States. Very often you don't have co-CEOs of companies, even though that does happen from time to time, although it's extremely rare. And you certainly don't have co-heads of school. You only have one leader of a particular institution at a particular time. So the moon makes a rational argument and says, if we're both great, well then neither one of us is really great, because you can't have two kings, in this case the sun and the moon, occupying the same crown, i.e. the heavens, both claiming to be important and grand, when in fact only one can really be in charge. And as a result of that contention, Hashem said, you're absolutely right, moon. I'm going to shrink you in size so that you will now be smaller in comparison to the sun, and we will eliminate any possibility of dual leadership between the sun and the moon. We'll make it very clear. The sun is the great light, Me'or Hagadol, and the moon is the small light, Me'or Hakatan. Rashi, who brings this Midrash, really has to deal with a number of questions about it, which he doesn't particularly deal with, but I'd like us to think about today as we explore this concept in some more detail. First of all, the moon doesn't really complain. So even if you tell me this is a metaphor, it seems rather strange that the Midrash would choose to actually put words in the moon's mouth. The moon is not an animate object, so it seems rather strange for the moon to be complaining. Second, the sun, even though it was contesting its status with the moon, doesn't get any airtime in this discussion. We only hear from the moon, as it were. The moon is the one who complains. God, it can't be that two kings occupy the same crown. So how come the sun's response to the moon isn't reported? The moon makes a claim, and we never hear anything about the sun, just the moon. Does this punishment really fit the crime? So the moon seems to make a reasoned, rational argument. As we said, you can't really have two people occupying the same space. It doesn't work. It naturally leads to conflict, especially if they're both equals in terms of their status. So does the punishment, shrinking the moon, really fit the crime? I mean, what did the moon do so wrong? It just pointed out an obvious fact about leadership. So why is it diminished in size? And finally, isn't the response a bit harsh? Even if you say that the punishment does fit the crime, it does seem like a rather extreme response. Maybe God could have reasoned with the moon. Maybe God could have responded to the moon. But instead, God says, you're right, we're going to shrink you in size. These are 4 questions that I'd like us to ponder now in a written reflection that you've received to accompany this video module. So go ahead now and pause the video and take out that separate handout that presents these 4 questions and asks you to reflect on them individually and to take each one and to come up with your own predictions to the pressing questions that Rashi and the Midrash must face here when deciding how to understand and interpret the shift in description of the size of the sun and moon here on the 4th day of creation. Go ahead and pause the video and complete that assignment. And when you finish that assignment, you can resume the video for the next steps. So now that you've had a chance to reflect on each of those questions separately, let's see if we can take a look at each of them one by one and provide some background information and understanding and context to each question. So the first question we had to deal with was the moon doesn't actually complain, right? The moon is inanimate. So if you were choosing a midrash to try to describe this, why put words in the moon's mouth? So here it is a metaphor about human behavior. The moon is actually meant to represent people. And so it's appropriate for the moon to speak because the moon is almost a substitute for human beings who would advance a similar claim in relation to their own particular struggles in life. What are those struggles? Well, people sometimes struggle with the concept of unhappiness. And we know all too well the human tendency to become jealous of other people's greatness. Even though we may have great things going for us, we tend to overlook our own successes, our own bright spots, and instead focus on the bright spots of other people and say, well, how can I be good if they're good? How can I be doing well if they're doing well? This is basically called a zero-sum argument. In a zero-sum argument, if one side is doing well, then the other side, by definition, is doing poorly. It cannot be that both sides are both doing well. The advancement of one side comes at the expense of the other. So this midrash is portraying people in a zero-sum argument, where people will say, well, if person A is doing well, then I must be doing badly or poorly, because my human happiness can only exist if I'm doing well. It can't be that someone else is doing well. I have to be the only one doing well. And that is unfortunately a tendency that people have to look at themselves as not only equal to or even superior to other people, but to relate their own human happiness to others and to say that they can only be happy if others are not. The moon in this scenario represents a jealous person. And in this instance, this is why the Midrash, it seems to me, receives words and is given the opportunity to speak. Because as a jealous person, so to speak, the moon is representing the human tendencies that we all sometimes have, unfortunately, when it comes to our happiness in relation to other people's happiness. When he says, the moon, that you can't have two kings who occupy one crown, that's a zero-sum argument, and that's not a truthful statement. Of course, it's possible for two people to be happy at the same time, and their happiness should not be mutually exclusive. One person's happiness can exist independent of the other person's happiness, and there could be a coexisting of happiness between two people. You don't have to make it a zero-sum argument of two kings who share one crown. Look at the next question of the sun's response, which is not reported here, although it would seem that since the sun and the moon were fighting with each other, the sun probably had a lot to say. And here I think the sun's response is muted for one very simple reason. He doesn't say anything. The sun does not respond. The moon makes the claim, the zero-sum argument of, you can't have two kings with one crown, Yefshar, L'shnei malachim beketer echad, and the sun remains silent. It wisely withholds comment when it sees that it's being criticized. Because the truth is, when someone's making an argument like that, when a person is tying his or her happiness to yours in a twisted fashion, there's really nothing to do. One of my favorite professors, Scott Goldberg, a good friend and a great mentor, has told me on multiple occasions that when you wrestle in the mud with a pig, you both get dirty. The only difference is that the pig loves it. So when you argue with someone over trivial matters like this, about your success coming at the expense of another person's success and your triumph coming at the expense of someone else's triumph, well, ultimately, you're just getting yourself dirty. And the person who argues that claim with you really enjoys it. The best thing you can do is not to say anything. In fact, there's a famous statement by Chazal that those who hear themselves being criticized by others, but do not say anything back in response, are considered to shine as brightly as the sun as it rises to full strength over the horizon. That Midrash is Hane'elavim ve'enan olvim, those who are embarrassed but do not show embarrassment, Shoman charpatan ve'ein mashivin, who hear others disgracing them but do not say anything back. Aleya makatu medaber, the Torah says about them, ke'oavav ketzeit Hashemet bigvurato. They are as beloved and strong as the sun as it sets out in full strength over the horizon. I think it could be that the source of that Chazal comes back to this instance in Sefer Breshit, when the sun, so to speak, does not respond upon hearing itself being criticized by the moon. It shines even brighter because it withholds comment. The third question we set out to deal with here was, does the punishment really fit the crime? And in this instance, I guess considering that the moon was focused on its own greatness, its size and grandeur, yeah, it does. It does seem to fit. The perfect antidote to arrogance is humility. The best way to address someone's arrogant claims is to point out the ways in which those claims are not really all that fantastic, to mute the criticism and the assault of arrogance with a bit of a dose of humility. And so literally, the moon was cut down in size to diminish not only the moon in size, but also in stature and self-perceived importance. And finally, we wondered whether the response here from God to the moon is harsh. And in fact, the moon points this out. The Gemara in Masechet Chulin, in overviewing this imagined conversation between the sun and the moon and Hashem, mentions that the moon says, God, it's not fair. Why are you shrinking me in size? And that's exactly why Hashem gives the stars to the moon. Take a look at Rashi, Ve'eta Kochavim, the stars, which are mentioned here almost as a separate entity, right? It says Hashem creates the Ma'orot HaGedolim, the sun, the moon, and then almost as an afterthought says Ve'eta Kochavim, and the stars. Well, why are the stars considered an afterthought? Are they not considered one of the celestial lights? I mean, they do come out at night with the moon, and the reason is because, at least according to the Midrash, metaphorically, the stars are given to the moon as almost the property of the moon, under the purview of the moon, in response to what appears to be a harsh response by God to the moon. In a way, though, you can say that even when God doles out midat hadin, when God responds harshly, he always mixes in a little bit of midat harachamim. And maybe the moon getting these stars was, in a way, a little bit of a silver lining to an otherwise harsh response. We've spoken a great deal about this interplay between din and rachamim here in class, and I think that perhaps it is one way to understand the almost tangential description of the stars, ve'eta kochavim, mentioned as almost an afterthought, as a passing description in the course of the fourth day of creation. So there's some lessons, I think, from this Midrash about how to be a happy person. One is to not suffer from the missing tile syndrome, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, is Dennis Prager's very, very famous and constructive description of how to be a happy person. We'll talk about that together when we return together in class. But basically it goes like this. Don't focus on the things that you are missing in life. Focus on the things that you have. It's obviously very easy for us to point out to ourselves the things that we lack. That's sort of human tendency. The sign of being a mature adult and having a growth mindset is not to focus on the things that we lack, not to dwell on those absences, but to focus on the wonderful things that are present in our life. And that means not being troubled by other people's success. You know, we always kind of look over our shoulders and say, hey, well, that guy's doing this, and that makes me feel badly that I'm not doing what he's doing. The truth is, compete with yourself. Focus on your own success. And when you have that attitude, you'll not only push yourself to do great things, but you'll be happier because you won't always be looking over your shoulder. And even if things don't go your way, try to find the silver lining. It's there if you look closely enough. You know, the moon had a big setback. It was shrunk down to size. And that was probably a devastating loss to the moon. Here it was, and equal to the sun, now less than the sun in stature. But it gets the stars. So even when you're cut down in size, even when life deals you setbacks, search for those silver linings, because those silver linings can ultimately provide you with a basis for being happy and for seeing the good in otherwise troublesome situations. At this point, you're going to go back and match up these descriptions with your own, and to compare these speculations, some of them are speculative. My take on the Midrash, some of them are actually rooted in Gemarot and Mamrei Chazal, statements by the rabbis, but this is my take. I wonder how it compares to your take. So go ahead and compare these notes to the notes that you wrote in your first written assignment. And in the second written assignment that you're going to produce, I'd like you to compare and contrast my take to yours. What do you see as similar? What do you see as different? And do you find my take convincing? If so, why? And if not, why not? Thanks for listening in, guys, and I look forward to continuing the learning with you in person when I return to class.